Okay, in this video we're going to cover sections 2 and 3 of chapter 27. So let's begin with section 2. Alright, we want to begin by talking about the components of this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And this is really the basis for a lot of how we tend to think about or intuit about how the macroeconomy works. So it's really important tool for figuring out how to explain policy, how to predict what policy we should take, as well as kind of make sense of the macroeconomy. So we have three basic components to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We have aggregate demand, and we have short-run aggregate supply, and we have long-run aggregate supply. So let's take each one in turn. So aggregate demand is a curve that shows how the change in price level will change aggregate expenditures on all goods and services. So in section 3, we're going to go in and do a little more development of the aggregate demand curve, look at its shape, and look at what shifts it. Short-run aggregate supply is a curve that specifies how shifts in aggregate demand curve affect price level and real output in the short run, all other things held constant. So we see from this, we want to see how the short-run interactions between aggregate demand and then overall supply in the economy will affect price level and output. And then long-run aggregate supply is the curve that shows the long-run relationship between output and price level, which there's actually not a lot of relationship between output and price level, at least at the level that we'll talk about long-run aggregate supply. But essentially what long-run aggregate supply tells us is what our potential is, so what potential output is. Okay, we're going to continue this video with section 3. And in section 3 we're going to develop the aggregate demand curve. So if from the previous part you weren't quite sure what the aggregate demand curve was all about, that's okay, because that's what this section's about. So the aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping. All right, let's back up again and remember, what is the definition of the aggregate demand curve? The aggregate demand curve is the relationship between overall price level and overall goods and services demanded by all demanders in the economy. Okay, so first of all, we see that this is a downward sloping relationship. It's a downward sloping relationship because there's a negative relationship between price level and overall demand for goods and services. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, we have something called the interest rate effect. The effect that a lower price level has on investment expenditure through the effect that a change in price level has on interest rates. Okay, so there's this relationship between interest rates and price level called the Fisher effect. Okay, and I'm not going to go into the Fisher effect in this particular class because that's intermediate macro. But the Fisher effect basically it postulates and shows that the nominal interest rate, all right, the interest rates we see in the market, move very, very closely together. They're highly correlated. They move in the same direction as price level. All right, and if you take intermediate macro, we'll show that both theoretically and empirically, that tends to be the case, that interest rates tend to move with price level. Now, if interest rates go up, what has to happen to investment? Well, investment becomes more expensive because you usually borrow to do the investment. That makes the investment more expensive, and so you do less of it. So as interest rates go up, what happens? Investment goes down. And so that reduces aggregate demand. That's the business sector demand. International effect. As the price level falls, assuming exchange rate does not change. Okay, we're going to hold exchange rate constant for right this second. You're going to say, well, wait a minute, but the exchange rate does change. And then you're going to say, well, wait a minute, what is the exchange rate? Well, first of all, let's define that. The exchange rate is the rate of exchange between currencies. So, for example, I could go out and I could say, all right, how many British pounds is $1 worth? All right, and it's not quite, actually $1 is not quite worth a full British pound. How many euros is $1 worth? In fact, $1 US is not quite worth one whole euro. Then we could say how many Canadian dollars, if we want to be really confusing, is one United States dollar worth. In fact, the US dollar is worth just a little bit more than one Canadian dollar. All right, there's that exchange rate, and there's markets to change currencies from one type of currency to another type of currency. And we call these the foreign exchange markets. And the rates, the prices that are set within those markets, we call those the exchange rates. We're going to hold those constant. Why are we going to hold those constant? Because let's just assume this is short enough run that those markets can't respond to change in price level. Let's say price level falls. What happens? Net exports rise. Why? Because if our price level falls, then our foreign goods become cheaper. All right, so our exports, the goods that we send out, become cheaper because our price level is lower. And relative to our domestic goods, the foreign goods become more expensive. Why? Because our price level fell. All right, so our prices went down. That makes the foreign goods more expensive relative to our goods, and our goods cheaper relative to their goods. And so what happens? People outside the country, all right, want more U.S. goods, so we export more. And people inside the country want less foreign goods, so we import less. And so what happens? Net exports rise. All right, so if net exports rise, what happens? Well, the foreign sector demand for goods and services in the U.S. goes up. And so that causes an increase in the overall output demanded, or this quantity demanded of the aggregate good. However you want to say it, it's kind of cumbersome to say that, right? So here we have an opposite direction between the real GDP demanded, real output demanded, and price level. So we saw that here as price level decreases, interest rates will decrease, causing investment to go up. So price level goes down. Aggregate demand for goods goes up. International effect, the foreign sector demand will go up if price level falls. Money wealth effect. So one of the things that we have to run into is that our checking accounts, our savings accounts, the cash that we hold in our pockets, all of these accounts are denominated in nominal values. That is current price level, current dollars, right? So let's say I have $1,000 in my bank account and the price level falls. Well, what happens? Well, I still have $1,000 in my bank account, and that $1,000 is now worth more. Why? Because the price level went down. So I can buy more with that same $1,000 that I had. So I feel wealthier. And if I feel wealthier, in fact, I am wealthier, then what happens? I want to buy more. And so that can affect particularly the consumer part, all right, the household demand for aggregate goods and services. All right, so again, we see in each one of these cases, as price level falls, it causes the quantity of output, quantity of production for the economy that we demand overall to go up. And then we have something called the multiplier effect. And we'll talk about this in a slide or two, but this is basically an amplification of the initial changes of expenditure. So if we have, say we want to buy $100 more worth of aggregate production, well, that will actually lead to a much bigger increase than $100 in our demand for aggregate production. All right, so the multiplier effect basically means that any one of these effects will have an initial impact, but then an amplified impact afterwards. So let's take a look. Let's go ahead and graph the aggregate demand curve. Now notice the first thing we have to do is label our axes. So the first thing we have on here is price level. We're always going to put price level here on the vertical axis. And then we're going to put real output here on the horizontal axis. And you'll notice something. This looks an awful lot like supply and demand from Principles of Micro. And it does. The difference is, instead of the price of one good being put here, we put the aggregate price level of all goods here. Instead of the quantity of a single good here, we put the aggregate quantity of all goods, or real output. We could also put real income here because output equals income. at the aggregate level. And then we draw in our aggregate demand curve, and notice it's downward sloping. Why? Well, because of those reasons that we just showed. See, right here. These reasons show that there should be a negative relationship between this price level and the overall real output that we demand. So let's say we have something happen. So price level falls for some reason. So we'll call these a shock later. All right, we'll talk about shocks later, but they're basically just stuff from outside our system that changes things. Okay, and we drop in price level. Well, there's all of these effects, and there's an initial reaction to this price level, which causes us to demand more. All right, so we move from Y0 to Y1 initially, but we're not done yet. Why? Because there's also a multiplier effect. And that multiplier effect is this. When we increase from Y0 to Y1, we have an increase in income. If we increase our income, that means we can buy more stuff, which means we might increase to here, which causes another increase in income, which means we can buy more stuff, which means we might increase to here, and so on and so forth until we end up with the overall effect. So anytime we have a change in the system, we're going to have an initial impact that actually comes directly from these effects, and then we'll have a multiplier effect. So let's talk a little bit more about what can shift the aggregate demand curve, because principally this is going to be what's very, very important when we talk about macroeconomic policy, because when we talk about short-run macroeconomic policy, usually what we're talking about is trying to manipulate the aggregate demand curve. So a shift in aggregate demand curve means that at every price level, total expenditures have changed. All right, so the total quantity of real output that we demand changes at every single price level. So we have 5 very important shifting factors. They're not the only ones, but here are the 5 major ones. Number 1, foreign income. Number 2, exchange rates. Number 3, distribution of income. Number 4, expectations. And number 5, monetary and fiscal policy. So foreign income. Foreign income is going to change that foreign sector demand, as well as it could change some of our domestic demand too, but mostly that's going to focus in on the foreign sector. Exchange rates are going to focus in on the foreign sector. Distribution of income can focus in on consumption. All right, and that household section, because if we have a very, very unequal distribution of income, so say a large concentration of income at the very top, the very most wealthy, well, that could actually be detrimental to demand. That could cause a decrease in demand because you have a huge amount of the population who simply doesn't have the income to buy stuff. Expectations are extraordinarily important. All right, they affect each and every sector of demand. In fact, I think we've talked about this before. Expectations of what will happen to a variable are oftentimes much more important than the actually what happens to the variable. And the reason for that is that when we make our decision about whether or not to buy a car or not, we don't know what our actual income for the future is going to be. We don't know what is going to happen. Are we going to have a recession? Are we going to have an expansion? We don't know all of these macroeconomic indicators or variables. What do we know? We know what we expect to happen. And so what we expect to happen is what we have to base our decisions on. And then monetary and fiscal policy. And we're going to spend a whole section talking about macroeconomic policy. So deliberate shifting of the aggregate demand curve is what most policymakers mean by macro policy. Yeah, like we said before, generally when we're talking about macroeconomic policy, we're talking about manipulating the aggregate demand curve. So let's look at some shifts in the curve. So the aggregate demand curve shifts out by more than the initial change in expenditures. So notice, anytime we have any kind of a shock, and a shock is just something, one of these shifting factors change, all right, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to have an initial effect. And that's going to move us out this. So, for example, the U.S. government could decide to spend an extra $100. All right? They're going to spend an extra $100 this quarter. And I know if you think $100 extra, you think, oh, that's really insignificant. And okay, $100 million. All right? Add as many zeros as you need to make it believable. Okay, that's the initial effect. But that initial effect creates an extra $100 million worth of income, which generates more demand, which generates more income, which generates more demand, which generates more income, all the way until we end up with the multiplier effect. And we end up with the total effect equaling the initial impact plus this multiplier effect. Now, a lot of the debate between economists, all right, over activist policy, non-activist policy, and these huge policy debates that we have and we talk about and you see in the political campaigns, and we'll talk a little bit about in the section on policy, really have to do with how big we believe this multiplier effect is. If you're a Keynesian, you think it's pretty big. If you're more conservative, you don't like activist type policy as much, you think it's kind of small.